On July 20th, 1944, the closest attempt to assassinate Adolf Hitler failed. As a result, the resistance movement in Germany was destroyed and almost 5,000 people were executed. Theologian and pastor Dietrich Bonhoeffer was one of them.
Germany, 1939. Hitler's rise to power stunned everyone with its speed and ferocity. The world watched in horror as the Nazis bullied first a nation and then a continent. But in Germany, a resistance was building that worked to dismantle the Third Reich from the inside. Their primary aim, assassinate Hitler. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a German theologian and pastor, was a leader in the cause. I sat down with author Eric Metaxas to discuss his new bestseller on Bonhoeffer's life of faith. Bonhoeffer, subtitled, Pastor, Martyr, Prophet, Spy. Wow. Why Bonhoeffer? Why do you want to do this?
Today, as Christians, we need role models. We need people. But there's something about Bonhoeffer. To me, he's the ultimate role model for Christians today.
Bonhoeffer grew up in an educated and artistic family in Germany. His father was a distinguished brain chemist, while his brother worked with Albert Einstein to split the atom. Bonhoeffer chose the field of theology, and while doing postgraduate studies at Union Theological Seminary in New York, he was surprised by what he found, or rather, what he didn't find. In New York, they preach about virtually everything. Only one thing is not addressed, or is addressed so rarely, I have yet been able to hear it, namely the gospel of Jesus Christ, the cross, sin, forgiveness, death, and life.
Yeah.
That sounds like today.
That's 80 years ago he wrote those words about the state of mainstream Protestantism in New York City.
While he didn't find sound theology in most of the churches in New York, he was inspired when he went to Abyssinian Baptist Church in Harlem.
And for the first time in his life, he sees African Americans worshiping the gospel preached with fire, with power. Everything about it touched his heart, moved him, and so he went every single Sunday, not just to worship, but to teach Sunday school. I think he also taught some adult Sunday school, so he got very involved.
White German in a black church at the beginning of the 1930s, right?
It's amazing.
Yeah.
It's amazing. He really was gripped by the whole idea of the racism and race relations in the U.S. There was nothing to compare this to in Germany. In other words, this was an American problem. Of course, just a couple of years later, Hitler becomes chancellor in 1933, and everything changes. Suddenly now, Bonhoeffer is facing, in Germany, exactly what he saw here. He saw a group of people, the Jews, being made to be second-class citizens, and he was, from day one, vocally fighting against it. One of the few Christians who understood what he saw.
He had foreknowledge. It was almost like a prophetic insight into what was coming in Germany in regard to Hitler. He read it early out.
I believe it was a prophetic insight.
And it cost him.
It always does.
To try to tell the German church, what became the Reich Church, that Hitler was evil, nobody was buying this.
No, it's a stunning thing to see how the churches and how the conservatives were co-opted and snowed by Adolf Hitler. Hitler was a genius in that he was profoundly cynical to the bottom, and he used the churches brilliantly.
Bonhoeffer helped found the Confessing Church, which opposed Hitler and the Third Reich, primarily their anti-Christian and anti-Jewish stands. But even with the Confessing Church, Bonhoeffer was almost alone in recognizing the depth of the problem.
He was always a step ahead and trying to rally them, and a few times he succeeded, but mostly he was alone.
Another issue that obviously came to the fore was identification with the gospel comes first to the Jew, then to the Gentile. That cost him.
Bonhoeffer is reading the scriptures and trying to show his fellow Christians that in the church there is neither Jew nor Greek, there's neither Jew nor Gentile. If a Jew wants to be a part of this church, we are obligated as Christians to welcome him in, to worship with him. This is the place, Bonhoeffer said, the church is the place where Jew and Christian stand together. Now, not only could the Nazis not see this, but many in the church could not see this. He wrote a circular letter where he's basically saying that what the Nazis have done to the Jews in Germany, they have done to God's people. The burning of the synagogues, this is an attack on God.
A spy. How did he become a spy?
1939 comes around and Bonhoeffer realizes he will be drafted, but he would not fight in Hitler's war.
Bonhoeffer sailed to safety in America, but after only 26 days there, he was on the last ship to cross the Atlantic before the war started.
He's seeking the will of God, and the Lord calls him back to Germany. He knew, I will have no peace in New York. Well, Bonhoeffer's family were all very, very involved in the conspiracy against Adolf Hitler. He had been providing them moral support, but this was the moment of decision. Do I take another step?
Bonhoeffer joined the Abwehr German military intelligence as a double agent. He acted as a courier for the Third Reich, but used these opportunities to make contact with the Allied forces across Europe. He had it absolutely resolved in his mind, philosophically, spiritually, biblically, that he could justify being involved in a direct assassination plot.
Yeah.
How did he resolve that with, say, Bible verses, Romans 13, that said you're supposed to obey those in authority?
Even many good Germans had no idea what was really going on, but Bonhoeffer knew. And he thought, if I, as a Christian, am unwilling to get my hands dirty to protect scores of thousands and millions of innocent Jews, I will not be able to stand before a holy God. And to have some fussy theological argument about, well, do I do this? Sometimes God requires you in obedience to take action.
But before the assassination plan could be carried out, Bonhoeffer was arrested and sent to Tegel military prison.
He was involved in trying to get a number of Jews out of Germany to safety.
Bonhoeffer was still in prison awaiting trial on July 20th, 1944, when the plot to assassinate Hitler failed.
Now the entire conspiracy, which has been working for on and off for practically 10 years, is completely exposed. At that moment, of course, Bonhoeffer's days are numbered.
Bonhoeffer was transferred to a Gestapo prison and then to a concentration camp. On April 9th, 1945, with the sound of American guns in the distance, Bonhoeffer was executed by hanging under the direct order of Hitler. Less than 3 weeks later, Hitler committed suicide and Germany surrendered to the Allies.
It's really tempting for us to look at this as a great tragedy. It's so sad, but I think that Bonhoeffer himself would rebuke us for having that point of view. And he would say, yes, there's a sadness, but to serve God with everything you have unto death is the greatest joy of life.
What's the message of his legacy to 21st century Christians or non-Christians?
He's the ultimate witness to a world that is not Christian, that he calls people to God with an authenticity that is literally, in my experience, unique. And it's a very, very important thing for us to understand that this man was a prophet of God, and he was utterly obedient to the Lord. For me, the joy of telling the story is to rediscover Bonhoeffer for a generation that never knew him.
Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the real thing.
The real thing.
It was the real thing. When he wrote his wonderful book, The Cost of Discipleship, he opened with this line: when Christ calls a man, he bids him come and die. And Dietrich Bonhoeffer certainly paid that price, and he paid with his own life. But it was not without his own internal struggle. As he looked at what Adolf Hitler was doing to Germany, he had this to say to a friend: it is not only my task to look after the victims of madmen who drive a motor car in a crowded street, but to do all in my power to stop their driving at all. And with that, he came to his own conclusion that he had to join the resistance, that he had to literally sacrifice his own righteousness. And that's how he put it: I have to sacrifice my righteousness so I can stop Adolf Hitler. Now, when you look at the atrocities of the Nazis, you have to look at it from the standpoint of, well, who built the prison camps? Who built the ovens? Who built the gas chambers. They had to know what the purpose was, who operated them, who loaded the trains, who unloaded the trains. Each step of this way, you look at it from the outside and you go, there's guilt here. There's blame here. Why didn't they stand up for what was right? Why did the Protestant Church of Germany fail so miserably in stopping Hitler? Well, there was a professor at Yale. He asked the same question. And he asked it during the time of the Adolf Eichmann trial in 1961. And what he asked was, what is the validity of the so-called Nuremberg defense? That I was just under orders. I was just obeying orders. And with that, you get the dichotomy of Romans chapter 13, where Paul commands us to obey those in authority. On the other side of that, you have what Peter and John said to the Sanhedrin when they ordered them not to preach the gospel. They said, we can't help but obey God. Which do we obey, man or God? We can't help but obey God. And that's the choice that every Christian is faced with. If you think this is in isolation and somehow if you were in Nazi Germany, you wouldn't have obeyed, well, think again, because Stanley Milgram found an incredible result. Going into this experiment, he did a survey of the psychology department at Yale, both the students and the professors, and they all said, well, you'll probably get 1% to 2% of the participants actually going forward and obeying orders to literally kill somebody. That will be the response rate. Everybody else is going to be strong morally, and they're going to turn against authority. They won't do it. Well, here's his experiment. You have 3 participants. You have an experimenter, the participant, and the supposed victim. And all of this is made up. And what was going on was a series of progressive electrical shocks, each 15 volts higher. And what was going on is the experimenter is dressed in a lab coat. He's there on behalf of science, and we're measuring the effects of memory. And then you have an actor in another room. And this actor in the other room would make pretend screams, and then they would have piped-in electrical noises as the electrical shock is administered. And then the actor would start complaining that he has a heart condition and this is killing him. And in this whole process, the participant, the subject of the experiment, is told to continue to administer shocks. Every time the actor gets it wrong on the memory test, they're supposed to continue to give them shocks. Well, as you'd expect, most people start objecting. And then the authority figure, the experimenter in the lab coat, would come in and he'd give them 4 different prompts. And these were all scripted for every single one. The first time the subject objected, the experimenter would say, "Please continue." And usually that was all it took, just a "please continue," and they would continue to administer shocks. And then as the thing progressed, they'd go to number 2. The experiment requires that you continue. And then when it got worse, it was number 3. It's absolutely essential that you continue. And then they got to number 4. You have no other choice. You must go on. And then they would add a little kicker. There's no tissue damage happening. This is fine. Well, what were the results? If you think you wouldn't be part of this. 25 of the 40 participants administered the highest lethal shock. And what in their minds was 450 volts of electricity. Now, the average outlet in the home in America is 110 volts. In Europe, it's 220 volts. It's a lethal shock. And when you start thinking 25 of 40 participants went all the way to kill someone in an experiment, there was only one participant who would not go over 300 volts. And that one participant was studying electrical engineering and had personally experienced shocks and said, "I don't care what you're doing. I know this hurts. I'm not going to do it anymore." Well, That's what the results were. And these weren't just average participants. Every one of the people here were all Yale students, and many of them suffered trauma after this experiment because they realized they too were capable of killing when someone ordered them to. You look at the genocide, you look at what happened under Hitler, and you say, never again. Well, genocides have been happening again and again. Just since 1950, here are the genocides with over 500,000 victims. Cambodia, Rwanda, Pakistan, Indonesia, and currently in Sudan, one of the greatest human tragedies of our day. All of this happening because people are obeying orders and not obeying God. So today, make up your mind. Are you going to be a Peter and John? And would you have the willingness to stand up to the Sanhedrin, knowing that your very life was at stake? Would you have the courage of a Bonhoeffer, knowing your very life is at stake? Whatever position you have, would you obey God or would you obey authority?